I think we have now to move to the next topic, which is also a very fascinating topic, is the question if Bitcoin citadels are real, and what are Bitcoin citadels? And Rahim, who's an expert on that front, will tell you now. Give him your hands.
Thank you. Well, to many of you, it will not seem like a very relevant question, so I try to explain why it's relevant. Are Bitcoin citadels real? Short answer is no, they're a meme. So as we're running out of time, I think I could stop right here. But unfortunately, or fortunately, if you know me, you know I don't like short answers. They're usually wrong or misleading. And the wrong thing here is probably that many don't really get what a meme is. Many people assume that a meme, of course, is a picture or a phrase like this that goes viral, means it's adopted by a lot of people. And they assume that that must be the perfect marketing, packaging. It's like some really bright minds did the perfect marketing ploy to influence our behavior. But that, of course, is not how viral things work. You can't understand the virality of a virus by looking at the virus and its objective parts. You need to understand the fit, the receptors. And that's how memes work. They are usually of very low artistic value. So it's not a lot of genius that goes into creating a meme. The genius is in the fit, is in hitting a nerve. And it's unfortunately not something that you can plan in advance. And in this very case, the value is even negative. That's interesting. And those are the most interesting memes. The value is negative. Bitcoin citadels emerged in a Reddit post, very written post, which was a hit piece, and it was mocking Bitcoiners, and it was mocking the idea of people retreating from society and holding on to their Bitcoin. So it was basically a dystopian story. And I think, unfortunately, but that's the way most people hear about free private cities, not, of course, here, but outside, have read a dystopian association of rich, elitist people retreating from society to their perfect cities. And I'll try to explain why the Bitcoin Citadel meme turned from dystopian scheme to, I think it's true, a reality and something positive, because it's expressing natural tendencies which are very positive but very hard to understand. And I think it's the same with free private cities. So one of the main criticisms, something is elitist, so only very few people understand it early and adopt it. And it seems so undemocratic, so unegalitarian, and it seems really hard to accept it in a society imbued by egalitarian values. And the other criticism is, oh my God, it's now these wealthy and maybe bright people retreating from the economy, hoarding their Bitcoin, not investing, retreating from politics, not offering all of the Swiss, the Germans, the Austrian, the option, but only a select few to go to a new city. And I think both criticism, they are sound criticisms, so they have to be taken seriously, but there's some misunderstanding. And it's first the concept of elitism. We think that when the few adopt something, I think the negative association is because we are used to live in a society that on the outside is very egalitarian, but on the inside is entrenched with privilege. Privilege is everywhere, conferred by certificates, conferred by status, conferred by the right connections, and so on. So we are used to the idea that if the early few are into something, they are there because they are privileged. And we get to expect that from our politicians now, who are really sometimes really good investors, and you wonder how come, and they are really successful business people after politics. Of course, before they never ran any kind of business, no business experience whatsoever for the average politician. But after politics, wow, they are successful business people. So we're used to that privilege. But in fact, every new technology, every new good, every new service is first adopted by a tiny minority, because if it was obvious, it wouldn't be new. So of course, most, in particular the inventors, the entrepreneurs, and then the first customers, most people would look at and shake their heads and say, oh my God, are those crazy people? Why are they doing it that way? Everyone knows you've got to ride a horse and not run on some steam engine stuff, which is scary and will not work anyway, and so on and so on. So that's the natural progress of a small minority using it. But a small minority does not have to be the privileged few. Unfortunately, and that of course is a sign of bad society, in more and more cases, those are the privileged few. But they only so because of cartels and of people not letting anyone in. And with Bitcoin, it was different. It was one of the very first investments with an infinitesimally small ticket size. So no matter your budget, you could and you can enter. And it's the only financial asset, or one of the very few, with no privilege necessary whatsoever to enter it. Of course, from the political side, you see, of course, because there's no protection, you can't protect the poor people from getting rich, which is usually about. But in fact, of course, that's why this kind of elitism, agreed, of course, if you're early in Bitcoin, it seems like you're still early, and it's quite an elite there. It's quite a few, quite a tiny proportion, but it was never linked to privilege, and so it's, I think, a different take. And so every exponential adoption, every exponential progress starts with the tiny. That's just the nature of the curve. For most of the time, an exponential curve, the surface area beneath it is tiny. It'll seem zero. And then, when it's caught on, everyone, of course, wants to get in and is in. So that's just the nature of things. And I think one should not mistake the tiny minority with a privileged elite. And that's why, of course, free private cities are so different from the colonialist ploys of the past. They are the opposite, entirely opposite of that. It's not like the privileged class of Germans now going to Africa and bringing German laws and extracting wealth back to Germany. It's the totally opposite of its tiny, crazy minority of people retreating more or less from Germany and other places, of course, and trying out something new. And with all likelihood, they may fail, but if they succeed, of course, it will seem like they were pretty early, and wow, the multiples will be impressive afterwards, when everyone knows that it has worked out, of course, and it's a safe plot, and then you can point the finger and say, oh, those elitist people, all those billionaires now running those cities, because it'll take eventually a billion budget, or billions in the budget, but it's a gradual and then sudden process. Now, what's the other criticism? Is retreating from society. And of course, with Bitcoin, there's again the economic side. The expectation also in this hit piece was that if you have an asset like that, people would just be hodling, they'd be hoarding their wealth and just be watching their wealth grow and not do anything productive with it. And I find what Daniel said about the door a very suitable analogy. Now, investing nowadays is a lot of panic investing. So, of course, you're fleeing the loss of your purchasing power, and everyone wants to go through the same doors, so there's some congestion, which is great if you're early, but quite bad if you're late. And of course, it's one of the only fields where economic modeling seems to work somehow, these panic situations where everyone behaves according to the animal spirit. Let me get out, I'm losing value or life, and so on. But fortunately, I mean, there's an unfortunate tendency that we tend to, if the model and the human beings are not a good fit, the worse for the human being, because of course the model comes first. That confers privilege and prestige and legitimacy and so on. But fortunately, human beings are not as described by the model. So we have the potential to first take a breath and think if we should run along with everyone else. And I think for sound investments, usually the question is first you've got to stop the panic, as Daniel said. And it's psychology immensely important. And I think Bitcoin has provided this for some people. And if it works out, as it seems, it may provide it. And this kind of hoarding, which is so abhorred by all economic schools as a sign of our stupid animal spirit, I think it's greatly misunderstood as people just doing the natural thing of trying to protect the fruits of their labor, to have the time and soundness to think about what they can build. And not build because they are fleeing the loss of the purchasing power, but building because they set an act of creation as a sovereign individual based on their autonomy. In the best case, of course, not talking about averages and so on, it doesn't interest me too much. The model kind of human beings is always the individual with his special background and ideas, out of which most may turn out wrong, but that's all about innovation. And what I think is greatly underestimated, that even if you take the point of being reclusive and retreating from society, literal. And then you think about, well, what's the worst? I mean, what's the worst way you could retreat from society? Like, even if you grant the point about keeping your purchasing power and then maybe do some great and sound investments, how about, I mean, really people retreating from society? And I think the craziest way you could retreat from society would be like, you stop procreating, you stop going about your business, you leave your family, you go to a reclusive location in the mountains. And of course, as a down-to-earth person, I say, no, that doesn't make sense. I mean, what should come out of that? Maybe some spiritual enlightenment for you individually, but nothing social of importance could come out of it. And then, of course, if I know some history, I should be surprised that even the craziest way of retreat was not only productive, it meant the survival of Europe. It was the monastic tradition, which is really hard. I mean, if you try to analyze it from now on and see, is that an option? You say, no, it's just so crazy. I mean, it's such a peculiar lifestyle. And I'm not saying that it'll work the same, but still in history, it's amazing that this movement of people retreating from society meant the preservation of culture and the flourishing of culture and science later on. So sometimes being able to retreat, sometimes being able to stop the panic really is the base from which you are able to preserve something, but not only preserving in the conservative sense, then creating something anew. And that I find most fascinating about the history of the monastic tradition. It's not just they just didn't pass on the books, not just that, by copying them. No, the monasteries became the centers of enterprise and technology and financial services later on. And it was, to a large degree, Irish monks who then, I think, were quite important for the flourishing of culture in Austria later on, which brought about the Austrian Enlightenment, which brought about the Austrian school, which I think brought about Bitcoin, but of course not. We don't know Satoshi, unfortunately. So sometimes ways are really indirect in history, and that's amazing. So something that seems crazy and impossible at the moment, if you then look back in history, of course, when everyone knows that it has worked out, it seems obvious, but in advance it seems pretty crazy. And I think there are a lot of things about that may be particular about the Western tradition and heritage. Of course, we have seen, fortunately, in the last few decades, how that can be picked up universally. We have technological progress, and I think innovation in every kind of field is something that fortunately can be passed on independently from the culture. But what's quite crucial about the West, and the reason why we're still here in the epicenter of global wealth in Switzerland and so on, is that impressive odd history of small autonomous development zones, which all, I mean, at the moment seem crazy, like all those farmers not getting along with their lords and wanting to create their own little canton somewhere, and it's all odd and it all seems crazy. But that's a large part of the heritage, and that's a large part of what led to the wealth explosion. And so I think there's a lot of analogy, and what the Bitcoin Citadel expresses is, of course, a longing. There's a longing by more and more people who've realized that, wow, sometimes really crazy things seem possible afterwards. I mean, you could take it up. In the gradual process, you can even take up a fight with the financial industry, which is one of the most cartelized industry, so much based on privilege and so hard to enter. And so why shouldn't you be able, after a while, after gradual progress, to take up competition in this other industry of living together? So I'd say it's a longing. In a sense, I think it was right to see this as kind of retreat, the Bitcoin Citadel meme. It's even an aesthetic break. It's a break of people looking around themselves and wondering if they are living in a world that really cherishes truth and beauty and the good. And if that's not the case, what are the options to look for? Where do you, maybe just on the individual level, how do you retreat yourself and your family and find some base again to just watch what's going on and figure out what you should do? So stop that kind of panic, which of course it's a surrounding time that leads to a lot of impatience and a lot of panicking and figuring out, oh my God, what should I do now? I'm already late. Tell me what to do immediately now, tomorrow. Give me your solution. Tell me which politician to vote for. Tell me which campaign will succeed in turning the tides of history. But the process that we've seen with Bitcoin, I think, then expressed itself, of course, in this positive longing that things become possible first by precedents, because you lose the fear of the impossible, and then it comes possible, of course, if they are in a way linked to wealth creation and wealth protection. In German, we call the word wealth Vermögen, and it's quite fitting. It says it's a capacity, and of course, we've got to be down-to-earth, pragmatic people. And so I'm very confident that it'll be Bitcoin wealth in the end that will enable this kind of competition and taking up this kind of competition, this kind of innovation to enter the market that's the hardest market to enter, because it's dominated by the most privileged, most entrenched, privileged providers who by definition don't like any competition and go after any kind of competitors. And I'd even say, to conclude, that in a world that seems more and more fake every day, I think there's not much more real than Bitcoin Citadels. Thank you. Unless like questions.
Questions?
Please.
Hi, hello. It's still Igal from Montenegro. You say that Bitcoin is real. And for me, I cannot comprehend the roots of Bitcoin technology. It's complicated, and I'm not a tech guy. So I just believe people, Bitcoin, it's okay, it's stable, it will work. On the other hand, once we all in the earth had the gold standard, and I can just to bring gold and to hold it in my hands. So how do I can trust Bitcoin? In the sense of
you're disputing if Bitcoin is real. No, I would not suggest that. I mean, you could have done that 10 years ago, or 11 years ago, or 12 years ago, but I mean, I think it'll be fairly crazy to ask the question if Bitcoin is real. But of course, I mean, no offense. The thing is, I think is behind, of course, and that's behind a lot of bad economics, is looking at the objective characteristics of something and assuming that value comes from objective characteristics. But the Austrian School of Economics, of course, as you know, it's about people having ends, that's a mental thing, and seeking means, which is a context thing. And then, of course, the means sometimes have physical properties, but a lot of the means don't have physical properties. And that's why we underestimate, of course, the things without physical properties. I think the largest part of capital, for example, is not calculated. It's not on the balance sheet. It's all here. And I mean, the more your knowledge economy, I mean, that's a term that's used too much probably to make any sense, the more it's processes, knowledge, experiences, preferences, and that's even mentalities, habits. A lot of that, I'd say, obviously is capital. I don't think you can dispute it if you try to understand what it means and what it's doing. And I don't think you can dispute nowadays with so many people. I mean, you can say for yourself, I don't get it, I'm not using it, I'm not seeing it as a means to my ends. And that's totally legitimate. And then, of course, you can have a discussion with someone who's using it, and then you try to figure out empathically, okay, tell me, I mean, what end are you trying to achieve with that stuff? It's just a speculative game. I mean, you're thinking to pass it on to someone else. Okay, help me understand that. But you can't deny the reality if so many people are using it as a means. You can think from the technological side, you can ask critical questions, and you can ask, is it a good means, will it be a sustainable means? And then you can ask the moral questions, are the ends good, and so on. But I don't think you can dispute the reality of something like that. And I think it's very misleading and quite a danger in thinking that only something that has shape, because then you would, for example, think that buildings that are still there, but empty and with no spirit, have more reality than the plan of a free private city in the mind of the creators of it. And I think that is very misleading. Now, I think there's much more reality, be shaped, that's in the minds, that's active. There is a spiritual force in the world. That's something that's just a physical relic of it. Of course, will have meaning to visitors and archaeologists and so on. But I don't think that in terms of reality, that it's more real as a city or anything than the expression of people trying to build a new city. I hope that answers it a bit.
About the question of escaping society. I was just in Berlin and talked to a lot of friends who were more like left-leaning, and one recurring argument is that, if you have a private city like, say, Prospera, then the wealthy and those who can afford it and those who are educated, maybe they leave. Yes. And the rest of the people, they're left with a even worse society. So what can you answer there?
Yes, that's not true. If you look through history, it has not been like that. And even if it partly, so it was not the privilege of the Roman Empire that basically moved and took with them the wealth. It was a mix of people, some by chance, some by being pioneers, and so on, taking with them not so much material wealth, taking with them the hidden, I mean, they still had some spirit to preserve and create something and engage in trade with other people. And then to not answer through history, because I now figure out that may take too long. In practice, that's not what we see. Even in Honduras, I mean, you say, okay, that seems so early. And then, of course, it's a Latin American country, and to have a high level standard of life potential looks like the rich expat destination. That's not the case. I think one of the three zones is a zone that is particularly offering cheaper and safer and better housing for Honduran laborers. So of course, I mean, they may not be the poorest of the poor, but still it's in no way an offer just for the rich. So it's rather the opposite. It's relatively wealthy people coming from the West, risking their reputation, risking their wealth to maybe make a point, maybe through some even altruistic motivations, maybe because they like the location, because they see a business opportunity and want to invest. But of course, investing always is risking. You're spending your money, you're not consuming it yourself. So it's not you go there to have the rich lifestyle. That doesn't make any sense. So anyone who thinks, oh great, I'll go to Honduras and have the rich lifestyle. No, that'll be the other way around. And usually it's the other way around. It's the Honduran oligarchs, if they're there, politically privileged people who go to Switzerland to live the life of the rich. So it's the totally opposite. But of course, you'd get that as a criticism, and I don't think I think it makes sense. That's why I try to address the criticism of elitism. And the question is really, how much privilege does it take to be part of a free private city? And I don't think it takes that much. Of course, it's not immediately obvious for every single person, but what the most it takes is a kind of the pioneering spirit, the willingness to risk something, and those I think are rather smaller ticket sizes than the usual ones for new innovative ventures out there.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. So I have a question that maybe is a little philosophical. Is it chicken or is it egg? Mm-hmm. Are they Bitcoin citadels because people want to take their Bitcoin and leave because they are being persecuted? Or are they Bitcoin citadels because those people wanted a citadel anyway and just needed Bitcoin to do it? And if we're talking about a free private city, should it run on Bitcoin? Should it run on its own currency? And what is to say that it will not end up being just as centralized as modern-day fiat currencies that are fundamentally what we try to escape from, not because we dislike the currency, but because it prevents that very existence in a citadel that seems to be desired throughout history, as you yourself mentioned.
The interesting thing I didn't mention was that in 2013, I think this text was written on Reddit, and it had a peculiar prediction, and it went like that. In the future, when Bitcoin price may reach levels like $1,000, unimaginable, and people would be really rich, then of course there'll be services for those rich Bitcoin people. And one of these services will be gated communities for Bitcoiners, and that'll be the Bitcoin Citadels. That did not happen. I haven't seen any service provider of gated communities, even though of course it makes sense if you hold a lot of Bitcoin, you should shut up, you should retreat yourself, you should protect yourself. But that's not what you're seeing. It's not what the Bitcoin Citadel meme then expresses. It was taken up by people saying, no, I want to do something different. I have a longing for something different. I have a longing for different aesthetic, for a different way of living together, a different way of doing things, because so many people are in hamster wheels. They are just, if they ask them, why are you doing what you're doing, is because they are pushed by kind of panic around them to do what they do. And then it's really just, okay, now I have this fuck you money, sorry, my English, and you think, and then you can stop the panic, and then you think about what are my options, what can I do? And some people then really like the idea, okay, maybe I could have my own island or my own castle, what does it mean? And it was not to protect yourself, it was to like just figure out something interesting to do and maybe try out and experiment with something. And a lot, of course, saw that in maybe interesting ventures, interesting hobbies, whatsoever. And I think it was the totally opposite. So we didn't see that kind of reclusion or like big gated communities, which of course I think from entrepreneurial thinking, it doesn't really make that much sense to say, hello, here we're in the Bitcoin Citadel, the Bitcoin rich, don't attack us because we are so well protected. That wouldn't make too much sense. So it was a bad prediction in the end, like most predictions, but it was a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that, yes, there'll be an adoption curve and yes, there'll be people having needs or seeking means, but they are different than what you expect it to be. And I find it much more positive now, this meme, and I see it becoming realities, like really people who have that kind of way of thinking about what interesting things can you do with that now. You don't have to please anyone, you don't have to ask anyone's permission anymore, you don't have to get a return necessarily, because otherwise you lose all your purchasing power. And then that's where I think it gets interesting, and that's why I think it was the most interesting parts of European history, where we had some of that kind of autonomy in the sense, what could we do? Well, which oceans could we go on? Which uncharted territories are there still to explore? And of course, most will end in failure, but some will maybe really find some new uncharted territory. So I think the Bitcoin Citadel is not about really having the gated community, it's about going to uncharted territory in an aesthetic sense, in a maybe political sense, in an economic sense, in a creative sense, entrepreneurial sense, and so on.
A big applause for the last Austrian economic in Austria, Rahim Taghizadegan.